part that, oh, thanks, Tom. The key element now is what I emphasized in part in the first lecture. We have to put aside our mental approach, our emotional approach, our historical understanding today that we have towards these events that are going to be discussed in this lecture. We have to approach it from the standpoint, at the very least, as a European living in the 1600s. We personally, I think, are more inclined to be able to understand that approach than we can the approach of the Native Americans, only because we haven't lived that kind of history in the same way. We've lived a European history. That's the way it is. But put it aside and try to think about what the 1600s were like. Because the people who came to this area, to North America particularly, stem from primarily France in England, and they had grown up and been educated and exposed to a culture that at the time had somewhat different dynamics in place than we experience today. And they encountered a culture with which they had had no previous connection or real understanding, because the exploration of the world beyond Europe and the edges of Africa and the edges of Asia had been very limited, and there had been no real understanding of what those native populations were, whether it was highly developed China or highly developed India or highly developed or reasonably highly developed Mediterranean coastlines. They just had never encountered anything like what they were going to encounter here. Last time we talked about how the Native Americans had struggled. Now I'm just missing my pointer, here it is. Among themselves. And I'm going to bring up something which I admit may seem somewhat offensive, but the idea behind it is to put yourself in the 1600s, all right? Many times when we are exposed currently to Native American ethos, we're talked about how environmentally conscious they were, how they respected all life. And if you remember the movie, The Last of the Mohicans, if you've seen it, in one of the opening scenes, the last Mohican kills a deer, and then he goes over and he blesses the deer, give me, you know, you're giving up your spirit and this and that and the other. Well, all nice. Did that actually happen? We have no idea. No written records are there. Yes, there were people who hunted with the Native Americans, but they didn't leave us records talking about this behavior. And then we talk about property. What among Native Americans was the approach to property? Well, we're heard that it's all communal. The Great Spirit has brought this land to us. It's all being shared. We don't own the land. We share it, and so on and so forth. Again, we don't have any written records to underscore that. So what do we have? We have how Native tribes behave towards each other. Did they view property throughout the North America as communal? The answer is not by a long shot. Yeah, my property might be communal, except if you enter my lodge, that's my lodge. You can't just walk in here and take whatever you want. That's not yours to take. So the concept of property becomes very individualized. But then what about the tribe itself? Well, Our property, our land may be viewed as communal, and what we do with it will be decided by a council or by the population in general. But what about those guys? Well, if we want their property and feel we need it, we'll take it. And then it'll become our property. And what happens to them in consequence, well, tough. Now, why do I bring this up? Because what we're going to talk about is not only this little element, I bring this up as a reference point, but the wars that existed that we are aware of among the native tribes themselves. I talked a bit about it when I talked about the Iroquois Nation and Confederacy last time, and why these 5 tribes, original tribes, banded together in order to do what? Stop fighting among themselves? Yes. Did they see all of the tribal land as communal? No. Each tribe had its own land, but they established what we would call a political entity to try to regulate behavior among themselves so that they wouldn't fight each other. And by consolidating their political structure, that allowed them to dominate surrounding tribes, the numbers of which, if joined together, far outnumbered the Iroquois themselves. But because those were not unified, each could be attacked and managed by itself. Now, the other thing we hear about all the time is how the Europeans, in arriving here, brought with them diseases which killed off a lot of the native population. I don't think there's any question about the truth of that, okay? I think we're very aware, but I also want you to remember when we talk about smallpox and measles, and for those of you who are familiar with American history, even after the Revolutionary War, when Washington required that his troops be vaccinated against smallpox, that smallpox was still a deadly disease in European North America, as was measles and diphtheria and a whole bunch of other things. And in addition, there were diseases here in North America to which Europeans had never been exposed. And a lot of them died. So I mention these points because we tend in this day and age to have a framework which wants to look at the good of each people who are involved, except when we deal with the white Europeans coming to North America. And most of us here have some connection to those white Europeans who came here. It's not our fault. I mention this slide because what this demonstrates is that even before the Europeans arrived, a 30% decline in about 350 years. Now, these are just estimates. I get it. It's based on some archaeological studies. To look at what happened and how they come to these numbers is up to the person doing the work, not up to me to explain it to you. But the idea is that there were enormous losses among Native Americans, as well as an unknown birth rate, an unknown level of infant mortality, an unknown amount of maternal mortality during and after delivery. So we have these different issues, and we have to be cautious in our own mind of just remembering we're the same species. So why would there be any distinct major difference among what happens to us as a species, given even cultural and superficial, and I mean that both literally and figuratively, changes in our appearance? Now, I'm talking about this, the Beaver Wars. Now, first of all, let me just clarify a definition. These are not wars in the European sense that involve a declaration of war and a particular, we'll call it conventional conflict that is ended by a treaty, though there are treaties that end some of these conflicts. But it's a much simpler thing for me to write wars than it is to write battles, conflicts, tensions, violence, whatever. So bear with me, it's a prejudice. I talked about this last time. Champlain, French, had joined with the Hurons, who had been battered by the Iroquois for a long time. And down literally at the southern end of what we call Lake Champlain, a Huron group encountered a bunch of Iroquois. Champlain fired his musket and he killed 2 Indians and wounded another one. And the Iroquois recoiled and retreated and said, oh my, how did that happen? And if you take a moment and look at the lower right corner of this painting, you'll see one Indian covering his ears. So fire, smoke, noise, and suddenly, because you can't see the bullet, this 2 other guys dropped dead. Why did this occur? Well, this slide, while it's very busy, and I appreciate that, is to consider that the colors, don't worry about anything else, just the colors reflect the number of different tribes. And this isn't even broken down into subunits. When you start looking at the number of tribes that lived under different names, you'll start finding there are literally hundreds that are living within a particular area in the Northeast and in the north central part. Of these groups, the dominant ones that we're concerned with have to do with the Iroquois in blue and the Algonquin nations that you see in a sort of tan yellowish color. And this is around 1600. These groups had been contesting with each other almost from the very beginning of their existence, with incursions and displacements and the rest. This was not a quiet period. In this particular situation, I showed this slide before, the Iroquois in particular had been attacking the Algonquin nations. Here it's called Iroquois du Nord, that's the French. But the point is that these were enemies from their perspective. And the word enemy also could be interpreted as just other. Not necessarily enemy in the sense that they're always fighting with us, though that was often the case. But rather that they're other, they're not us. And therefore we can go take from them what we can. These wars went on, as you'll see, the Beaver Wars, for 90 years. Well, it's not quite the 100 Years' War in Europe. And like the 100 Years' War in Europe, it was an on again, off again, on again, off again kind of issue. The same is true here. So why are they called the Beaver Wars? And who's involved? And I stole this slide from Wikipedia just to give us a concept of what's involved and who's involved. Notice that the Iroquois League is on one side, and look at all the others on the other side. The strength, 4,500 to 20,000. The number of warriors, how did that get determined? It's a lot of guesswork, but if you'll remember from other lectures, it is unusual for any group to have more than 10% of its population as a warrior or military class. So you can inflate these numbers to 45,000 and 200,000, but it's important to remember also, just in terms of the fine details, that unlike in Europe, for example, where you had to be of a certain age before you joined or were forced into the military, many times you might have what we would call children, 12, 13, 14, who had been raised almost from infancy to be warriors and be hunters. So they learned how to use the atlatl until it was replaced by the bow and arrow, to use the stone weapons that I showed you before until they were replaced by steel, and then to learn how to use guns, as an example. So they went on these raiding parties as well. And what was the conduct of the raiding party? It was generally very brutal. So that when you fought an opposing tribe, this isn't a matter, and you may have heard this in reference to the Plains Indians doing something called counting coup, C-O-U-P, French word. And what that meant was you would get close enough to an enemy that you would strike him with something, but you wouldn't necessarily kill him. But the more of those enemies you struck, the more powerful warrior you were. That's not what happens here. You go into this fight, you're going in to kill and to capture. And it doesn't matter who's on the other side. Men, women, children are perfectly adequate targets. And when you capture someone, you have a couple of choices. You can make them a slave. You can incorporate them into your tribe to replace people who've been killed, and you need to keep your population up. And that becomes a critical element in the Beaver Wars for the Iroquois, because you notice their numbers are nowhere near what the surrounding tribes are. Ritual torture, where that was a communal event. Everybody participated. Men, women, children. Or, on occasion, cannibalism of your defeated foe. And I mean real cannibalism. I don't mean just like you see in The Last of the Mohicans, where he cuts the guy open, takes out his heart, and takes a bite out of it. Yeah, they did that. They also opened the skull and they took scoops out of the brains. But I'm talking actually cooking somebody. Okay? And there are many accounts by French and British that reference them. So there's an issue, again, shows up in a number of movies, but we don't pay attention to it very much. But especially out west, but also true in the east, they'd say, save the last bullet for yourself. Because they knew what would happen if you were captured. Now, the next couple slides are busy, and I'm going to go through it while you read it to just emphasize a couple of points. We forget that the French established Quebec in 1608. That's just a year after Jamestown, roughly 1607, 1608 timeframe. The Dutch were there in 1610. Why? Trading. What did they know about trading? For almost 50 plus years before Quebec was set up, in Jamestown and New Amsterdam and so on, explorers had been coming to North America and trading with native tribes. When they were doing that, the wealth that they perceived drove more and more people with government support. So governments support businesses, okay? So you can support your economy at home and provide the resources to make your people content with their situation. So they begin finding that when you're trading with Native Americans, what doesn't cost you very much at home gets you a real premium when you come here. Some beads, some iron pots, some clothing that they've never seen before, but it's in different colors and fanciful, and maybe some silver or other types of jewelry for adornment and things of this nature. But remember what happened at the lower end of Lake Champlain. Oh, we want one of those. Okay, guns. Because guns are easy to learn to use, and with some practice, you can be reasonably accurate at short distance. And if I have one of these, and people throw these terms out, it's a thunderstick. Okay, call it what you want, it's a gun. That if I have enough of these, I can dominate another group that only has bows and arrows. Oh, okay. So, as the Dutch trading posts are established in the Hudson and Delaware rivers, and the word Delaware is actually a corruption, and I made this error. It was called the Delaware tribes, not because that's what they called themselves. They called themselves the Lenape. So where did the word Delaware come from? It came from Lord Delaware, and they named the river after him, Delaware. And so we called the tribe in that area, or the Europeans called the tribe in that area, the Delaware. Again, one of these things that I just learned. Access to European goods. Now, we've got the ability to trade. What are we as Native Americans going to trade? What do we have to give them? We're not going to give them canoes. They don't need them, right? They don't need stone implements, right? What do they want? They want corn? Yeah, not really.
Beaver pelts.
They want fur, beaver pelts. And if you've ever had the chance to feel and look at a beaver pelt, it's really remarkable. Think of how water repellent it is and how soft it can be and how with proper manufacturing you can make things out of it. And deer skin's another thing you can use because you can make that into some forms of leather, which you can use for clothing and shoes and things of that sort. The beaver became the primary pelt. And if you want to trade, you have to go find beaver. Well, you can only get so many beaver out of a particular area, right? So if you want to trade and you begin to find it harder and harder to get the beaver you want, what do? You give up trade? You give up those implements that now your tribe has become accustomed to having, like iron kettles. She got one, how come I don't have one? I want an iron kettle. Oh, okay, I better go get some beaver pelts. Look at that jewelry she's wearing, those beads. I want some of those. And I'm not placing blame, but the point is that life became more comfortable if you had these, and it became more alluring. So now you say, yeah, that last stream of, where I got beaver, they're all gone. If I go over the next hill, maybe I can find them. Well, pretty soon that's exactly what begins to happen. The conflicts begin to arise. Now, who's trading with whom? The Iroquois are trading with the Dutch. How about the Algonquins? They're trading with the French. Why? Because that's where the French trading posts are, and that's where the goods come in. And you don't have to cross Iroquois land to get the goods from England. So the Iroquois say, you've still got beaver. Guess who's coming to dinner? Now, the Iroquois are surrounded by other tribes. They're able, because of their power, to co-opt the Lenape, the Delaware, under their control. But some of the other tribes are very resistant. And even when you bring the Delaware in, if the Delaware begin to accumulate weapons, they may begin to revolt against Iroquois authority. So the tensions exist considerably. Well, 1628, Mohawks drive the Mohicans. Maybe that's why it was the last of the Mohicans. They got driven across the Hudson River to the east. Who's over there? There have been tribes over there for centuries. Now you're going to push the Mohicans, so that's why there's the last of the Mohicans. Why? Because the tribes there are saying, we don't want these people. And they've been forcing themselves on our land. And the Iroquois, particularly the Mohawks, are saying, you ain't coming back here. So you're either going to get your own territory or you're going to get destroyed. And they weren't above destroying the Iroquois. Scarcity of beaver, well, you have to keep pushing further north and further west. So you begin to deplete them, and what that does is it pushes the Iroquois into regions where the French had an interest in their trade. So now the French are saying, what is this going to mean to our trade deficit? Okay. The French already were, in a sense, pouring more money into New France, Canada, than they were getting out of it. And they don't want to see that trade deficit get even worse. And then, of course, they hate the English. So by and large, whatever the English is doing are bad, and we're going to try to confront them. So the pressure increases. Another tribe is driven out. But you'll notice this has been going on for almost 40 years. And the French finally get a treaty to end this conflict, sorta, because what happens next? Now remember, from a European standpoint, the idea is when you sign a treaty, you are held to the conditions established under the treaty if you want to maintain the peace. The Indians, and again, not disparaging term, never use this sort of thing. A written document? Are you kidding me? We might exchange wampum pelts that lay out some of these things in a form that we both understand. But this kind of treaty, we've never even seen before. So they have to be taught, in part, what European culture means when you apply it to a conflict. And if you don't adhere to the terms of the conflict, the treaty is broken and you go back to status quo ante. Well, didn't take long. By the very next year, the Iroquois, bringing pelts to the French now, that was part of the agreement, are told, listen, you have to give the pelts, sell them is probably the proper arrangement, to the Hurons, who will sell them to us. Because in Europe, when we have a primary resource brought somewhere, we have a middleman who disperses it to those who want to buy it. Well, the Iroquois say, you got to be kidding me. These are ours. Screw the Hurons. We're not going to do that. We're going to sell them to the French. And if you're not going to take them directly from us, we're taking them to the English. Fighting breaks out. Okay. Now, the Wendat are to the northwest. The Susquehannocks are to the south. The Susquehannocks have a relatively powerful tribe, and they have been getting some guns from the Dutch. Remember, the Dutch are still in charge here, not the English so much. And Over the course of time, the Susquehannocks are buying guns. So they're now representing a military threat to the Iroquois on their southern flank. But if the Iroquois are distracted into the northwest, what do they have to protect their southern border? A very limited force. So they see this as something that's troublesome, and they quickly want to force the French to stop the fighting again, so they go up and attack Montreal and Quebec. They can't take them, but the threat is real. And in addition, they force the neutrals and the Eries out of their tribal areas. The Eries basically disappear as a tribal nation with that identity. Okay? And you've not heard of the Wendots, and you haven't heard of the neutrals, right? Exactly. So, by 1658, the Iroquois have turned south. They've engaged the Susquehannock. They've beaten them to a pulp because they're concentrating their efforts against an isolated tribe. The Susquehannocks disappear. Okay? Gone. Would we call that genocide? Think about it. They're gone. They eventually extend their reach, something that we, or at least, not we, I didn't appreciate. I always thought that the Iroquois were primarily a New York-based group. Okay? They control from the Virginia colony to the St. Lawrence. They drive the Shawnee out of Ohio country. They take over Illinois. They're at the edge of the Mississippi. Yes.
I have a question. You talked, is this genocide? Now, there are two ways a tribe can disappear. One is killing them all.
Right.
The other is assimilation.
Right.
Would not assimilation have been a more effective way to eliminate a tribal identity and enhance your own?
You've raised an interesting point, and I'll touch on that briefly here, and then we're going to come to it in another segment of the lecture. Okay. Remember that I said you take captives and you bring them into your tribe to replace your losses. All right? So that's a form of assimilation. The women and children you don't want. They're a burden. Screw them. Other tribes might assimilate, but most of the time, they're also looking at it and saying, these are a bunch of refugees. They don't share our particular local culture dynamics. We are not in the mind of accommodating them and granting them a sort of sub-identity within our tribe. So that kind of assimilation doesn't occur. And we'll come to that when we come to the Pequot War.
Michael?
Yes.
I'd like to point out that the term Iroquois here is used in two senses. You're referring to the Five Nations as the Iroquois, but many of these other tribes were culturally Iroquois. They spoke an Iroquoian language, the Erie Neutral Susquehannocks.
Right.
My wife did her master's thesis on pottery, and you cannot distinguish Susquehannock pottery from Cayuga pottery, except the Susquehannock is shell-tempered, and the Cayuga is grit-tempered.
Right.
But stylistics, they're the same. So they're very, we're very close. Yeah. When he uses Iroquois, he's really using it as a political term and not a cultural term.
Correct. The Algonquin language is one that also was a shared language, but I go back to this particular phrase that has been used in the past, that America and Great Britain are two similar nations divided by a common language. And it's important to just keep these kind of dynamics in mind, but Tom is absolutely correct. Now, what changes dramatically in North America is that when the Anglo-Dutch wars are concluded in Europe over trade, over what was going to happen with commerce, the Dutch lose and they turn over their settlements in North America to the English. Now, the English have been aware, because you remember that the colonies that were established in Plymouth and in Jamestown and so on were English colonies. It's not that they don't understand anything about what's going on in North America. They understand, and they understand the power of the Iroquois. They're also concerned about the power of the Iroquois, as I've demonstrated in these two slides that take us what the Iroquois have accomplished in about 50 years, fighting against other native tribes, okay? What the Brits do initially is they say, you know something, the last thing we want to do is sell guns to these people, because it probably won't be long before we're going to be fighting each other. So there's a hiatus, and the Iroquois get really annoyed because they need the guns in order to keep their authority. Now, the French, meanwhile, remember I showed you earlier that the Iroquois had gone up to Montreal and Quebec, tried to destroy those settlements. They were unsuccessful. So in the process, the French now said, you know, these guys are getting to be a royal pain. They won't adhere to a treaty that they signed just a little while ago. They're attacking our allied Native American tribes, and they're interrupting trade, because when they raid up along the St. Lawrence, they're going to destroy settlements and they're going to kill a lot of people. Now, there aren't a lot of people there to begin with, but that doesn't matter. They're killing them. And they're not just killing them. When we go to a destroyed settlement or village, what do we find? Mutilation. This isn't just a matter of having an arrow in your heart. You know, we like to show you that in the movies, right? You're dead. Okay, not the case, okay? These are brutal conflicts. So you witness that and you say, that's what we're up against. Our local militia, which we've tried to use with Native Americans, hasn't worked. They get ambushed, they get killed. These are French citizens who are getting massacred. We have to send over some properly trained regular military forces. And this is the first time that there's a regular military force sent from Europe to North America, okay? I'm leaving out the Spanish because they don't have much of a role in the area in which we're interested right now. So they send troops over. The first time they send them and try to punish the Iroquois, they get punished in turn. Oops, didn't work the way we hoped. So they send more troops. It's beginning to sound like Vietnam, right? And they go, and they actually are reasonably successful in damaging the Iroquois sufficiently that the Iroquois begin to pull back from their holdings and their raids. Now, as this happens, the English begin to say, French presence in North America, maybe not a good thing. We hate the French anyway. There's a whole lot of nonsense going on. I use the word nonsense loosely. In Europe, and we need to counter the French presence. Oh, this sounds a little bit like countering the Soviet Union or countering China or whatever. We have to counter them. So what are we going to do? Well, we set up this thing called the covenant chain. What does that mean? We're going to open trade And what do the Iroquois want?
Guns.
Guns. So we'll start selling them guns. Because now, if they're allied with us, not only do we get the benefits of trade, remember how expanded the territory is the Iroquois have taken, even with a relatively small population. So the density remains, that is, the population density remains primarily in central New York area, but it is pushed out and it's diluted at the fringes. So if they have guns, maybe they'll be better able to protect those areas, control the trade, bring the pelts back to us, and we can send them on to Europe. As I mentioned, down here, with that support, the Iroquois are able to push some native tribes right over the Mississippi, and as I already mentioned, destroy others, like the Susquehannock. Did you have a question?
Yeah, the French were actually in North America in two different places.
Yes.
You have not talked about the fact that they control the Mississippi starting in New Orleans.
Right.
And that control should have produced an effort against the Iroquois expanding west.
It did to a degree, but the problem was that the French population was so low, given the enormous distances involved, that they had no significant military presence. Now, it's true, they were in Louisiana area and so on.
St. Louis.
But their presence there was so small that it was really just for trading purposes. They had no significant military presence. Remember what I said, is that the first regular troops that are sent to North America are sent by the French, and where do they go? Quebec and Montreal. Why? Because they need to fight against the Iroquois. Okay? So again, think of more globally, if you want to look around the world today, and think about how this is very similar to what you see happening in other parts of the world. There's nothing brand new about this. This gives you an idea, I'll come to it in a second, of the Iroquois nation at the conclusion of what I've referred to as the Beaver Wars. Now here's where things get really weird, but let me take your question first.
Do we have any idea of percentage of weapons the Iroquois had against opponents? Like, they had like 40 guns per 100 versus 5 guns per 100. I'm sure both sides had guns, but you're making me think that the Iroquois must have had a substantial superiority of firepower.
I have no numbers. The basic issues of the lines that I followed had to do with what implements the native tribes wanted and whether or not having those implements made a difference. What I said in the last lecture was that at short distances, a bow and arrow was more accurate and you could fire it faster. Okay? So why not use a bow and arrow? Because the firepower of muskets, even back in the 1600s, was such that, yes, an arrow might penetrate, but remember, they're not entirely naked all the time. Some of them are carrying shields and things of that sort. You fire a 1 ounce lead ball at 600 miles an hour, because that's about the speed at which it's traveling. If you get hit with that, even in the arm, you are out of the fight, okay? That's the kind of stuff that they were beginning to see. And if you load a musket with buck and ball, it's like a mini shotgun. You can take out 2 or 3 people. The noise is intimidating. The smoke is intimidating and it blocks lines of sight. So there's a whole lot of different issues that relate to that. I will encourage you to stick with the lectures, even if you get tired of this and want to skip it. That in the last lecture, George Cummings is going to bring some of the stuff that was used during this period of time, and particularly around the time of the French and Indian War. And it's really a fascinating thing to see.
I'll try not to get off subject too much, but I'm constantly thinking about the economic changes the Indians are encountering. Their self-sufficiency is diminishing constantly.
Right.
They keep looking toward these foreigners for leadership and for the kinds of things that they want to have.
Right.
This is all undermining their culture.
Right, exactly. And so what resistance can you offer to the incursion of what is seen, even by your own people, as benefits from taking some of this advanced technology, like steel or iron, and having knives and axes and guns, yes, iron kettles, other, spoons, and things of that sort.
Yeah, this turning toward the foreigners is diminishing their entire structure.
Exactly. So now you have to ask yourself, that is indeed the consequence. But then why does it happen? And in part of what we're dealing with in these lectures, peripherally, but you've raised a very central point. And I've raised this question in other forums is what happened to the Native Americans inevitable? Now, in the first lecture, I mentioned that they had a profound barrier against immigration. The Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. What happened once the barrier was breached?
As soon as advanced technology occurs, it becomes a major force of change.
Correct.
The Manhattan Project.
All right, another example, but I'm not going to stray off to there. I'm going to ask you a different kind of question related to it. And that is, does anyone here think that if Columbus hadn't discovered America, right, just use that as a starting point, that the Western Hemisphere would not have been discovered? No. You'd have to be an idiot to think that, and I'm sorry if you do think it, but you've got to be an idiot. Because if it didn't happen in 1492, it was certainly going to happen in the 1500s. And if it didn't happen in the 1500s, it was going to happen in the 1600s. Okay? That was what was going to happen. Why? Because the technological advances in Europe were such, the enthusiasm for trade, the exploration mindset, like wanting to go to the moon, or explore the stars, or go to the depths of the ocean. There's an inherent human characteristic. Curiosity is a way of saying it. To find out what is out there. What's on the other side of the hill? What's on the other side of that river, that lake, that ocean?
Technology always calls the doom.
Well, it's more than technology. That allows you to make real your drive, your ambition. It's a tool, but the tool only has utility if you have a purpose behind it. If I hand you a screwdriver and say, here's a tool, make a loaf of bread, you're gonna say, you can't do it with this. Of course not. Use the tool for which it was created, yes.
Well, also depletion of resources in Europe, especially as their population is growing. They've depleted wood, they've depleted, entire range of forests, and they're going to need to go elsewhere.
And there's some interesting climate-related issues that I showed in the first session that had enormous impacts as well. And remember that when I just showed you statistics on the 30 Years' War, right? 30 years, talking only about Western Europe, as we understand it, 3 to 4 million deaths. And then we have plagues, we have crop failures, and a whole lot of other things going on. Exploration is driven by necessity. I've run out of beaver. I want to continue to trade. There's beaver over there. I'll go there and get them. Well, what about the guys who were there? Tough. Okay? If I'm more powerful, I'm going to drive them out. Tough on them. Okay? Yes.
I remember Columbus was looking for a quicker passage to India. So if he hadn't found North America at that time in 1492, in 1493, another group looking for a quicker passage to India would have discovered it.
And this is another part that I find very peculiar. And I'm sorry to digress down this line because we have so much to cover. People think that Columbus thought the world was flat. That's crap. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, knew not only that the world was round, they had a remarkably accurate measurement of the circumference of the world. So to assume that somehow Europeans who studied Greek and Roman literature and grew their cultures based largely on those inputs somehow thought the world was flat. Now, some of you also may have heard the name Tycho Brahe, right? Robert, I'm going to put you...
non-instrumental astronomer who ever lived.
Right. And in the 1600s.
In
Okay.
Denmark, Veen Island.
Yeah. And from, who was his disciple? Do you remember?
Kepler.
There you are. So you're looking at a culture that is scientifically enormously advanced. Shipbuilding, as I showed you on the previous lecture, was enormously complicated, but they did it beautifully. Because international trade was in critical importance to Europe as a whole. All right, I'm going to go on. What I said before is that things get complicated. This is why. The Beaver Wars are primarily fought among native tribes. The French and the British give support, but they do not provide much in the way of any military force other than militia. Relatively poorly trained in the military arts. So they take their training and their experience primarily from what Native Americans have taught them and shown them by working together. So when you're with another tribe and you attack a native village of an enemy, and you see your Native Americans killing everybody and scalping and mutilating, it's not too hard a stretch to think a level of peer pressure will lead you to behave similarly. So the mindset, again, you have to look at the mindset of the time and what you would have experienced. Were you going to go and stop a Native American from killing this other Native woman or her child? You try to do that, you know what's going to happen? You're the next victim. You might not participate, but you're not going to stop it. Okay? Okay. Keep this in mind. This is brutal. Was Europe brutal? Absolutely. But I mentioned in my last lecture the Treaty of Westphalia that tried to put some controls over what was going on and to moderate the brutality of war. Now, the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, is 600 years after, right? We're going back now to 1000 AD, CE, with a peace of God that Pope Urban put in place to try to stifle unbridled violence against what he called the innocents. If you aristocrats want to go out and kill each other, which is your fun and games, go ahead. But leave the innocents alone. He set out rules of conflict that were to be adhered to if possible. Was it always adhered to? Of course not. But the point is that that was one of the first attempts to regulate the violence. 600 years later, there's a more formal arrangement. And military forces in Europe at this time, those under the control of a government, were faced with certain regulations of how to conduct warfare. These principles are completely different from what's happening in North America. Okay? All right. The Great Peace is finally signed, ends the Beaver Wars. The French sign with them. The Iroquois say, okay, we'll stop raiding. Oh, we're going to let the return of refugees. Does that sound familiar? Have we heard that term applied recently? Right of return. Shawnee, okay, we can come back into the Ohio country, lower Allegheny. The Miami tribe was not Miami, Florida. All right, the Maumee is another way it's been pronounced. Potawatomi go to Michigan, Illinois go to Illinois, interesting. And the peace lasts for a while, and that's great. In response to this, the English are going to act as well. Now, I'm going to take a break here. Let you stretch your legs a little bit, bathroom break. Ask questions if you wish, whatever works. Let's reconvene at quite soon, maybe 5 after 11. So let's just take the next 7 minutes. And then we'll come to the Europeans.
An interesting aside.
Yes. Well, trouble afoot. Guess who shows up at your front door unannounced and unwanted? I mention this because we're aware of Jamestown, and some of us may have visited there and seen some of these early settlements. But the point that I want to make about it is this. Relatively brief period of time passes between the brown structure of 1650 and the green of 1700. This kind of incursion of immigrants with a different culture, a different ethos, a different political structure, and certainly technological advantages over the inhabitants there creates enormous tensions in and of themselves. Now, there's a song that was very popular a number of years ago. I think it's He Gives Me Fire. You may remember it. I can probably sing a Hume that I'd destroy it, right? But, you know, Captain Smith and Pocahontas had a very mad affair. When her father tried to kill him, she said, "Daddy, don't you dare. He gives me fever." That's it. He gives me fever. Okay. You remember that one? Okay. Sorry, not Gives Me Fire. The Powhatan were the major tribe in the area of Jamestown. And when the British sent their first colony to be established there, a previous colony by the Spanish having been destroyed utterly, and a small colony at Roanoke, which was to go to that area and try to reestablish, disappeared, the lost colony of Roanoke, it's called. It appears that they were all killed off by the Powhatan. So when the English arrive in Jamestown, They're given instructions by the king to say, make nice with the natives, okay? Otherwise, you're not likely to last. So what do they build when they're in Jamestown? They build a small town. They build a church. They build a palisade to protect themselves from the Native Americans. They're not worried about bears and crocodiles and things of that sort. And within a very short period of time, bringing in the goods that they brought, and I say this with appreciation, the natives said, you know, you got some things we like. Now, in our culture, you can just go and say, I like that, and you have to give it to me. This is gift giving. This is how we settle minor tensions among ourselves. If you don't, then I might take it. And within a short period of time, there are a couple of situations that arise where this kind of issue crops up. And it already creates difficulties. On the other hand, the second part from the Native American side is, you got these people here who are going to starve to death over the winter. We'll try to help them out if they do things for us. Because if we're going to share food, that means we're on shorter rations than we might have otherwise. Now, I'm not going to put my family at risk of starving to death to help some guy who's arrived here just a little while ago and has no real reason to be here. Why should I put my family at risk? So a lot of the Jamestown colonists die over that first winter, and they survive only because a supply ship arrives early enough in the spring, at which point, instead of abandoning Jamestown, they decide to stick it out. But now you've got more people coming in, and the populations begin to change. Now, throughout the areas of North America, which I've listed here, this slide is actually a reductio, almost ad absurdum. Yes?
What was the fall line that was indicated on the past map?
Which line are you referring to?
It says fall line.
Oh, the fall line. That was just a rough idea of what the English had taken by force or by agreement from the Powhatan.
Thank you.
You're not to go beyond this area, and you'll notice it extends even further south. It's not a autumnal change. I want to show you this because this shows you what Native Americans were facing of various settlements. And you look at this and say, well, those populations don't seem too bad. And over a period of 80 years, they go from 350, to 210,000. That's hard for us to assimilate when 210,000 represents a population increase in English settlements alone that is comparable to almost the entire population of Native Americans, excuse me, east of the Mississippi and north of the lower boundary of Virginia. You have a population increase that is equal to that of Native Americans. With their advanced technology and everything else, what do you think that outcome is going to be? Now, what about Native American population? As I'm showing you here, pre-contact, 200,000 to 500,000. By 1750, now remember, I showed you a slide at 1690 for English population. A drop of 60 to 80% in some regions. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons for it that I've outlined: epidemics, colonial wars. I've mentioned some of the other ones in here. Land dispossession, that highlights what was going on. Now, if your population is diminished to that point, how do you resist? You can't. You're going to get forced out. There's just no way. The cultures are so disparate. Could Europeans assimilate Native Americans into their culture?
No reason to.
Not only no reason to, but even if they wanted to, and remember, there were attempts that existed throughout all of North America up until well into the 1900s. And what do people call that today when we try to assimilate native tribes into European American culture? Genocide. Because you're eliminating their language, their culture, their history. You're saying, if you want to be part of us, you have to be like us. Okay? And that's why that word is thrown around. But the other dynamic you have to look at is the population was falling off rapidly. And that power of resistance was going to be undermined considerably. Now, when I come to colonial wars, we're actually going to back up in time a bit. Because now what we're going to talk about is how the major actions by the English, primarily, but also the French, become an important military force driving what's happening in North America. The Beaver Wars, think of that as Indian groups against Indian groups. Now the Europeans are really bringing power to bear in these conflicts. These are some of the ones we're going to touch on. We've already talked about the Beaver Wars. We're going to talk about some of these. Down at the bottom, I have the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War because they play an influence on what's happening in North America. What resources can be allocated to North America during these particular conflicts, as well as the devastation in Europe itself. The Powhatan Wars were in the Jamestown region. I mentioned this before. 1570, Velasco, an Indian, converted to Catholicism, comes back with Jesuit missionaries, and then he leads the Powhatan to kill them all. Well, that's interesting. Englishmen from Roanoke come. The Powhatans actually tell them that the Spanish were killed on the orders of the chief. And what happens to the Roanoke colonists? They disappear. Well, it's not likely, we know they didn't sail back to England, so they're gone. The first war that really breaks out, notice the date, 1609. Now, when I use the word war, remember, these are mostly small battles that are taking place. But famine led the Powhatan to cut the settlement off. They're beginning to say, you know something, we don't like these people being here. So if they starve to death, that's okay with us. Get them out of here, they're a danger. If they get a foothold, they're going to get a stranglehold. Reinforcements arrive. The English saying, we're tired of starving. We're going to go raid settlements and we'll take the food we need to survive. You're living, remember, these are primarily civilians. Yes, some are trained with some military background, but this is not a disciplined military force. I've got my wife and my children, and they're starving, and there's food over there. Oh, will you trade? Hell no. As far as we're concerned, you guys can all die. can't go home, what am I going to do? Am I going to let my family starve to death? And myself? No. If I can get that food, I can keep my family alive. And if that means I have to kill you to get it, I'm willing to do it. Okay? We've not been in that position personally. But when you read accounts, even from the periods of time like Leningrad being under siege, or Sarajevo, which was under siege for over 1,000 days, okay? Longer than Leningrad. Then you begin to ask yourself, that's what starvation is like. Or the Holodomor in Ukraine in the 1930s. So conflicts go on. Pocahontas is a real character. She marries John Rolfe, not Captain John Smith, but it didn't fit in the lyric properly. And peace is arranged. She's actually about 16 at the time, sort of like a Romeo-Juliet kind of situation. But they abducted her first, thinking that would have leverage against the chief, and then things got a little more broken down and they were able to solve it. The second war occurs. Notice this. Powhatan Indians massacre 1/3 of the settlers along the James River. They're pissed off at the incursion. We've had enough of this nonsense. Get rid of these people. And remember, this war is brutal. Years of raids and counter raids. So once you attack my settlement just north of here, and I'm centered in Jamestown, I'm going to get a bunch of people together and we're going to show you what we're made of. We're not going home. You hit us, we're going to hit you harder, right? Okay. Third war, 2 years worth. Try to drive the settlements of the Virginia colonies, several hundred are killed, and eventually a treaty of sorts is signed. Now, we don't know about native losses in any direct way because no accounting was made of that. But the Powhatans took a beating. Otherwise, why would they agree? Right? Okay. The Pequot Wars. This is in Massachusetts, right around Plymouth. And there's some settlements that had been established throughout this area. The Pequot, all right, the first part, the Pilgrims I talked about last time, allied with the Wampanoags to fend off the Narragansett. The Pequot was a major tribe, and about 10 years into this colonization, they extended considerable control. And as a result of that, they also are trying to control the fur trade. Now, when this happens, as we've talked about in the Beaver Wars, and this is part of it, there's a lot of violence. Something else begins to undermine what's going on with the native tribes in this region. We hear about the word wampum. We really don't quite understand all of the nuances related to what that is. But it was, in some ways, a form of currency. Now, remember the old adage that when Manhattan is bought from the Indians, they give them like, I don't know, $15 worth of beads or something of this sort. Within a short period of time, and I use the word somewhat loosely, manufacturing centers were set up, two in particular, one in the Connecticut region, one in New Jersey, and they produced wampum. Think of Henry Ford, and you've got a production line. What happens when you start introducing lots and lots of wampum into the society?
It's devalued.
Exactly. So what does that mean for the native tribes? They can't compete with wampum production. So basically their currency, is being undermined. Now, the colonists aren't using wampum among themselves, right? They're using a whole different monetary basis. So things begin to spiral out of control. 1635, there's a massive hurricane that goes through. And in addition to this, we also had some other major changes in the climate called the mini ice age that we'll come to in a little bit. The Indians are pissed off, they're struggling. So they see a ship and they say, let's get out there in our canoes, we'll raid the ship. They kill a trader who's in charge of it. They loot the ship. And this eventually leads to war, because when the word arrives to the colonists that this ship has been taken, what did they normally do? They say, well, let's go find who did it. And let's go ask politely to turn over the perpetrators. Well, they all look alike. Okay. So what happens? They end up showing up on the wrong shore. They start accusing people of having murdered this guy. They end up saying, it wasn't us, it was those guys, which is, of course, what you're going to do, even if you did it. So this is where things get very confusing. But it sets off a whole lot of reprisals, both by colonists and by the Native Americans in the region, and particularly the Pequot. And as these raids continue, and they really become very destructive, the settlers are able to consolidate enough military force to attack the settlement at Mystic. And I showed this because this shows what happens when the Native Americans are attacking a settlement. And what you will notice are the bodies laid out and so on. Those are not Native Americans. Those are some of the settlers. If you get up real close, you can kind of tell. But the point is that it is a horrific event. And a witness account writes this. This is where historical records can distort what you want to interpret. Cut the dead bodies into quarters. Open most of them while still warm to drink the blood. This is what they see. You may remember from the last lecture, I showed you a picture of an Iroquois warrior, and then I showed you what we might euphemistically call a skinhead. I don't know if he was truly that, but with tattoos. And I said, if you're walking down a dark alley and you run into this guy, and it's not a great neighborhood, what's your initial reaction? Yes, Robert?
Well, this might sound terrible, but it's just carrying the English tradition of hanging, drawing, and quartering to another extreme. So it's not that much different than is going on in the old world.
The differences are these. First of all, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, there was no drawing and quartering that occurred in North America. The second part is that drawing and quartering was the result of a crime being committed, sent to trial, and the execution was carried out this way. This is very different. This isn't a trial.
Well, the end effect is about the same.
No,
You're
dead
still
is
in
dead.
pieces.
No, you have to understand the ethos. Remember, you see, you're bringing modernity to it. Don't bring modernity to it. Put yourself in the 1600s and go to a settlement and see that the bodies have been mutilated. Women, children, men, doesn't matter. They have been mutilated. Your perception of that is very different from having someone accused of a crime, taken to a court, found guilty, and punished. And drawing and quartering was a very uncommon form of execution. It was saved for the most egregious troubles such as treason against the crown. Okay? This is commonplace. Mystic is attacked. Now this is a representation. What you will see, if you look carefully, is the Native Americans had a palisade, it was surrounded by both, remember, there are no British military here. These are militia. And they're native allies. They surround it, they lock them in, they breach the palisade, they set fire to it, and as a consequence, those who are trapped try to escape, and many of them are killed in the process. In other words, we've just seen what happened to these sets of settlements. How are we going to treat those guys? We're not going to give them English prisoner of war status. As far as we're concerned, these are brutes, and they deserve to die the way they killed our people. All right? The rules of conflict are different. This also shows, and I want to demonstrate this because you'll see how there's different concentrations of English settlements. Now, English settlements during the 1600s were hardly nice places to be all the time. There was no religious tolerance. And if you read back in some of those histories, you'll find that if you disagreed with the prevailing religion in that region, you were kicked out, right? At best. If you were a heretic, you might find yourself literally burned at the stake, executed. But the point I'm making is that within a period of time of just 15 years from Plymouth being established, you see all of these colonies developing. And this is where a lot of the Pequod War took place. The mini Ice Age has an enormous influence as well. Talked about this briefly before. In Maine, June 1637, temperatures were so high that people preferred to travel at night when it was cooler. They didn't have air conditioning, okay? Thomas Gorges wrote about this. The winter of 41 to 42, piercingly intolerable. No Englishman or Native American had ever seen anything like it. Massachusetts Bay freezes. The summers of 38, 39 are very cold, food scarcity, and on top of that, pestilence from insects and birds eating up your crops. So things are not good in the middle 1600s. But this isn't the end of the fighting. A Wampanoag chief, known by his English name, King Philip, decides that the English settlements, again, are creating too many difficulties. There's too much tension, there's too much lack of understanding, there are no basic accepted values between the two cultures which allow them to come together. A lot of this is based on economy and force. And as a result, he finally decides that enough is enough, and we're going to go to war against where I showed you those English settlements, primarily Connecticut and Massachusetts, exist. They attack one particular settlement at Sudbury. They get through the palisade, they attack the blockhouse. You can see the fire and misery that's going on. And there's a lot of death and destruction that occurs with these types of raids. And King Philip does a pretty good job over the short time of this fight. But eventually, again, the settlers seem to be thrown back on their heels, but they muster enough power, enough unity to come together. They chase the Narragansetts into a fort, surround the swamp, and then attack it, killing 600. King Philip got away for a short period of time, but he was tracked down and killed. It's believed that he was killed by a Native American. Doesn't really matter, he's dead. And some of the native tribes that allied with the English helped in destroying the Pequods, so that the Pequods are done. The few survivors seek refuge with other tribes, and to some degree are assimilated. But their assimilation means their identity is gone. There's no more Pequot. Okay? Now, why do I put this up? There's another bit of psychology going on in North America, particularly in the English settlements at this point. So I'm going to digress for just a moment. We're going to come back to this. The colonists here saw themselves as Englishmen first, with all the rights and privileges that are due an Englishman, with a huge but. What is different in North America from being in England? 3,000 miles. That means governance functions very differently. Who's in charge? The Crown appoints some people, but the Crown can only send over a governor. Can the governor run a colony? No. And he's not bringing over a sheaf of papers that say, here is English law that's going to be used. He might have that as a foundation. But the colonists are going to look at that and say, wait a minute, we need a voice in what you're going to tell us to do here. You're not a king. You're not the entirety of the political organization and legislative organization. We're going to have local councils. And we're going to work with you over how to handle it, but you're not going to tell us what to do and have us just nod our heads and say yes sir, no sir. It ain't going to work here. Okay? So you're already beginning to see a sense of independence rise up against royal authority as it exists in North America at this time. And remember, there is no British army here. Okay? They don't come until much later. So what we're doing here as colonists is we have to organize ourselves so we can function properly. We need to have a set of rules. But you can't tell me that Parliament, 3,000 miles away, 6 weeks by ship, is going to determine what happens next week here in our colonies. You better work with us or else. That's why I bring up Bacon's Rebellion, which frankly I hadn't heard about until I started looking into this stuff. Berkeley is the local governor in Jamestown. And he says, this is how things are going to work. Well, the natives, as I showed you in a previous slide with the Powhatan Wars and so on, are raiding settlements and things are getting pretty feisty. And the settlers are saying, enough is enough. You, as the governor, call together a force, drive those SOBs out of here, and let's establish a perimeter that allows some peace to exist within these regions that we've colonized. And Berkeley says, listen, I don't want to piss off the Indians. We've got to kind of make nice, all right? So stop retaliating. Stop getting a group of guys, a vigilante group, we might call it today, and go out and attack some settlement that had nothing to do with what happened to you, and stop killing people. They say, they're killing us. Aren't you going to defend us? Aren't you going to organize us? So this guy, Bacon, who arrives, is initially a merchant. He's reasonably wealthy. He's reasonably well positioned. And he starts talking to a lot of the colonists. And he says, you're being ignored. So we have to do something. So he goes to Berkeley and he says, I want a commission to raise a military force, militia force, and go out and clear some of these SOBs out of the area and show them who's boss, and let's have some peace in our colonies. Berkeley says, the heck with you, and here that gets so heated that Berkeley opens his shirt and says, if you want this, you got to shoot me first. Well, Bacon backs down temporarily. This is who Berkeley is. I've already discussed a little bit of what caused the difficulty. This is who Bacon is, right? And he says, enough is enough. So he organizes to get rid of Berkeley. And he goes into Jamestown. Berkeley literally runs away, gets out of Dodge, gets out of Jamestown, and he burns the town. The natives are restless. Only this time, it's the English colonist natives who are increasingly seeing themselves as Americans as well. And this subtle increase over time becomes one of the key seeds for what's going to happen in 1775. You're beginning to see it happen here when you have a revolt in an English colony against the royal appointed governor. Enough is enough. Berkeley is basically told, you're ineffective. I'm sending over somebody who can take care of this. Herbert Jeffreys arrives in 1677, and he crushes the rebellion. Now he's beginning to have real military show up. Still a very limited presence, but now you've got a portion of the British Army with all of the things that go along with having an army in place. Because remember that just before this, not very many years before, there was the English Civil War. And armies are rampaging around England, killing and destroying each other. And it results in a mess in England. But the military becomes a dominant force. We can do what we want. Now, I'd also mention that the French had had their fill of the Iroquois. They just said, listen, you guys are just too hard to deal with. And you keep raiding and you keep doing all kinds of things which are unsettling our settlers. And remember that I said they sent over 2 regiments earlier on to try to stop the Iroquois, which finally ended the Beaver Wars in 1701. Now they send over a new guy, Denonville, 1685. Louis XIV, right, remember that guy, the Sun King, says, listen, I got plenty of problems over here in Europe, but go just take care of it, will you? Do what you have to do and stop this garbage. So he goes down and starts to attack some of the Iroquois settlements, particularly some which would be abandoned in anticipation of the arrival of these French troops, along with their native allies. And his raids are conducted, something we don't learn much about, but if you travel in New York, this is where a lot of this happened, our very own state, okay? So Denonville goes down and he's decided, I'm gonna punish the Iroquois sufficiently that they're going to just stop. It's enough. The Iroquois, of course, are saying, oh, this is the French. The British are over here. How about if we talk to the Brits and see if they'll help us? And the Brits are thinking, I don't trust the Iroquois. You might be on your own for this one. The Senecas ambush one of his columns. They were very adept at this. This is an ongoing theme well into the 1800s, where they keep setting up ambushes and people keep walking into them. But the various points here is that the style of fighting is now getting more formalized because you have a formal military force. Now they bring over initially the kinds of tactics that they used in Europe But they find out pretty quickly that there are real deficiencies in these tactics, and they better adapt pretty quickly or they're going to get annihilated. So things like this that happen to them produce repercussions that will permeate what happens in the rest of North America, almost from this point on. So when you wonder, why do I bring up something relatively minor? This is a transition point. This is not militia now. This is regular army. That has a very different structure and organization and tactic, and you have to adjust to your circumstances. Yes, Robert?
Where is Ganondaga?
It's near, if I go back, it's near Canandaigua. Okay? So the perversion of terms. Remember, Indian language was not written down. So most of it was based on phonetics as far as what Europeans would write down. And one of the great difficulties of reading through the histories is to find all these different names and pronunciations by different people. They're talking about the same place. You think, God, how do I keep this straight? You don't. Yes.
It's worth noting that Ganondagan is a historic site, and you can visit it.
Yes.
And there was a village there, but there's interpretive trails, and it's right near Rochester, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, Canandaigua.
Yeah, exactly. And this is part of what makes being in New York so very special. So much of the history is right here, within driving distance. And if you avail yourself of those opportunities, just a day trip, plus you can go through the wine country and get drunk. And then there's some nice inns you stay in to sober up so you don't drive when you're drunk. Okay. So what happens is that Denonville finally is able to convince the Iroquois, you've had enough. We're going to keep coming at you. You better settle your hash. Remember, this is treaty stuff that the Europeans are used to. Now, the Iroquois have been learning about treaties because they've established several already, but to them, it's still a piece of paper, right? Almost like the beginning of World War I, when Germany invades Belgium and the Brits say, we're going to go to war unless you pull back. This is not World War II, it's World War I. And the Germans say, you're going to go to war over a piece of paper? Oh, okay. He meets with the chiefs and he says to himself, good chance to decapitate, get rid of the leadership. If I get rid of the leadership, the rest will be cowed and they won't have an effective leader because the political distress that will arise will be considerable. So he grabs them, sends them to France to be galley slaves. Well, the Iroquois are not cowed. They say, the heck with you, we'll show you. So they start destroying farmsteads, slaughtering families, because that's what they do. Right? That's their mode of warfare. The French retaliate by finding a depot, if you will, of corn and burn it. What they don't take home, they burn. And this puts the Mohawks in particular with starvation. And if you're going to starve, you go raid in order to avoid starving. They want to go to Montreal, but they can't really get there. So they find another target, more vulnerable, at Lachine. 1,500 of them. Different sources claim different results. I don't pretend to say this is the most accurate or whatever. It's just an example. Prisoners tortured, some eaten. And in 1701, remember, this is the French. Remember, this is also the end of the Beaver Wars. This great peace of Montreal ends this particular conflict. And the British say, Now, wait a minute. If the Iroquois have a treaty where the Iroquois aren't going to raid the French, and they maybe have French support, they're going to raid us. So let's make a treaty with the Iroquois and just kind of put them in the middle. So this treaty is signed by the Treaty of Nanfan, which is actually named after the Governor General who organized it. And this is the issue of the Great Peace that I showed you before. I'm not going to leave this slide up long, but basically this is an agreement to try to create peace, and it lasts for a while, probably longer than the peace treaty between Gaza and Israel and the other signatories. Now, the idea behind this slide is just to show you is a little difference from the slide that showed you the extent of the Iroquois conquests. So add all of what's there in that lime green back to Iroquois control, and they give up all of that. So the tribes that they had displaced can return, and they reconsolidate themselves there. During the course of the Beaver Wars and these other conflicts, the Iroquois suffered enormous casualties. What they rebuilt with were prisoners who may have been kept alive and incorporated into the tribe, but whose actual allegiance may not have been with the Iroquois themselves. And there was also an influx of Jesuit missionaries who had been converting as part of their mission various Native Americans to Catholicism. And this was setting up a cultural dynamic which was destroying some of the very basic tenets of Native American culture and belief, things that you were alluding to. New York is divided up. Englishmen were very familiar with the need for organization. How do you organize? Break things into components and establish control over different areas with the properly elected, not necessarily, selected people. And that consolidates your political arena and allows you to function with a modicum of peace because you have shared values and laws. If you go to New York State House, you can see this document. Prior to independence, governors ruled, having taken into consideration the necessity of dividing the province into respective counties for the better governing and settling courts, your legal framework, how you're going to adjudicate disputes, being enacted by the governor, council, and representatives, and by the authority of the same, that the said province be divided into 12 counties as followeth. And here's the original document, setting up the boundaries. This is key. This is very different from having a settlement with porous kind of borders. Right? You know, where's that tree? Is that on your side or our side? Well, I don't know, whatever. That's a settlement. But now, that tree's on my side. Okay? You come in here, you're coming into my area. So this kind of organization has profound effects. What's it based on? The concept of property ownership, which permeates Europe, even if nearly all the property is owned by the aristocrats. But one of the impetus to coming to North America was the access to land that was unavailable to you in Europe. When I have my land, my place, my castle, all right? This is mine. And that's what's being established. And this is happening throughout much of North America, but I use this because you can go to the State House and actually see it. I'm going to conclude with this because this will take us to the 1700s. King William's War. Well, this is the King of England, as it turns out. But the reason I bring this up is that now we're beginning to get into major conflicts which pit not just the British against the Native Americans, but they're beginning to fight with the French. Now, it's still a sideshow, but unlike what we saw before, now the two European powers that are prominent in this area are going to come to blows. And this begins a whole nother train, which will eventually lead us to the French and Indian War. Now, I'll just spend just a moment and then I'll take questions. This particular conflict has other repercussions, particularly you'll see here on the right, Phipps to Quebec. How do you get to Quebec? You have to go up the Atlantic coast. You have to get past Louisbourg. You have to get down to Quebec. How do you get past Louisbourg? That's French area, that's Acadia, and so on. The English had been establishing presence there, and as a result of their presence and the conflicts that took place in Acadia, they basically said, you Acadians are a real pain in the butt. You got a choice. You can swear allegiance to the English crown, or you can leave. It's a little bit like Gaza. We're going to tell the people in Gaza, you're going to give up your culture and ethos as defined by Hamas, and you're now going to side with the principles and values established by the West.
And there's no New Orleans to go to.
Yeah. So the point is that when Phipps arrives in 1690, General Frontenac, who also is the governor and has set up other ports and forts along the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario, says, nah, we're not surrendering Quebec. Go home. And shortly thereafter, because of circumstances in Europe, this particular conflict ends. Now, this is the last slide for this session. And what I want to show you here is just kind of interesting. The peoples of, you see? Peoples near the mountains, the peoples in the high regions, as they called it, all right, on O-H-A-U-T. And how they depict the different tribes so they can try to understand who's who in this complex matrix. So we're going to stop here. Robert, we're coming to Queen Anne's War. Yes.
In providing muskets, you also create a dependency. Because the Indians can't manufacture gunpowder or shot.
Right.
So that would allow a degree of control as long as you can control the supply.
Correct.
Were there irregular forms of supply of gunpowder? Were the Dutch providing it to the Iroquois as well as the French, or?
There were a couple different ways in which that happened. There was the overt legal trade. The Native Americans with whom you were doing that particular trade would say, we want X, Y, and Z. We need gunpowder, we need bullets, we need more muskets, so on and so forth. And this is how much we need. And to get this, we will pay you that. Say, well, you know, that's not quite enough, and you have that negotiation back and forth. And you sometimes have the governor general telling you as a merchant how much you're allowed to sell at any one time. You're only allowed to sell this much. Can't sell that much. When you raid a settlement, besides killing all the people, you're also looking for loot. Every one of these settlements has a gun, powder, lead ball, because that's how the settlers would live and hunt and protect themselves. So you'd gather up anything you thought was worth taking. Now, do you think that any of the merchants back then were very Christian-like in their approach to the world and very generous and compassionate and didn't want to evade taxes and didn't want to evade government authority? Of course not. Smuggling.
Same thing today.
All the time. Humans have been doing this for eons. So in terms of the approach, there's a whole lot of stuff going on. A good part of it is illegal, according to English law. But if you're on the Native American side and you can go find a trader who's got some weapons and powder and ball, and you give him a bunch of pelts that he can sell at a premium, hey, why not, right? Why pay more than you have to?
And the voyageurs were pretty much out of control anyway.
I'm sorry, the who?
And the voyageurs,
Yes.
were pretty much out of control anyway, so.
Well, when you say out of control, true, they were explorers. But remember, if you are a voyageur, that's the boat people, as opposed to the coureurs de bois, who were called the forest runners, if you will, the frontiersmen, we might call them. What is it that makes you money?
Pelts, beavers,
Right.
and stuff.
Trade goods. Bring them down,
Come
bring
in,
them back.
sell them, get drunk, and go back.
Sure, it's like most things. People are people. Some are going to behave, some aren't. Some are reasonable, some are not. And how those things play out becomes very individual. That's more aligned to human behavior than institutional behavior. And there's where the great difference begins to show itself in what happens from this point on. Native Americans tend to have a very loose political system. It's based on very much an individual's prowess, ability to provide, for men to demonstrate your ability as a warrior and a hunter, literally bringing home not so much the bacon, but the deer meat, okay? So those things play a role, but when you have a political entity that is very well organized and has a certain amount of authority that you've agreed to, and I can come to you and say, I'm conscripting you into this militia. You're going to leave your family, and you're going to join this group, and you're going to do what I tell you to do. It's a very different ethos, a very different set of governance and values. But you submit to it because you can see a value which accrues to you personally, and by extension to your community by agreeing to that. When you don't agree, then the certain degree of force can be brought against you. Oh, I refuse. There's the stockade. We're going to put you in that prison until you agree. Well, my family will starve. Then get your ass over where I told you to go. Okay? So we have to keep in mind that this is part of a very complex, not just institutional system, which is what I was just alluding to, but a value system. What has brought you together to act in a particular way that allows you concerted action? And how does that play a role with what you see as a culture that doesn't behave that way at all? And we'll see more and more examples of that as we build up to the final lecture, which will cover the French and Indian War. Thank you for your time. Stop recording.